Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Christopher Muther, travel writer and columnist for the Boston Globe. I'm here with Peter DeBrine. He is the Senior Project Officer for Sustainable Tourism at UNESCO. Uh, Peter's going to talk to us today about the um, effects of climate change on some of these cultural sites that UNESCO has designated as important. This means places that we as travelers want to see and would like to continue to see in the coming years. Peter, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Chris. It's a real pleasure.
Uh, Same, definitely the same. First, for folks who are not familiar with UNESCO, tell me a little bit about the organization and what you do.
Yeah, so UNESCO is the culture organization of the United Nations. We're based in Paris, and where I sit within UNESCO is what we call the World Heritage Center, which is in the culture sector of UNESCO. UNESCO also deals with science and education, so those are the S and the E of UNESCO.
Okay.
Um, and we serve as the secretariat for what we call the World Heritage Convention, and we designate sites on the World Heritage List against a certain set of criteria, and we have both natural sites and cultural sites.
And how many sites roughly do you have right now?
Well over 1,100, and we designate probably between 18 to 25 per year.
Wow. Um, and these are all over the world, everywhere, it sounds like.
Yeah, correct. Not every country has signed the World Heritage Convention, but most of them have. I think not every country has a World Heritage Site, but that's one of the strategies for the future is to try to get those underrepresented countries to have sites on the list. Most of the sites are, as you can imagine, are in Europe. I think China is probably a close second to, to countries like Italy and Spain and France. They have well over 50 sites on the list.
Wow. And so I imagine it's a group of um, people from UNESCO who go out and make the determination based on cultural significance, historical significance, and
Yeah,
those sorts of
yeah,
factors.
Yeah, there's a whole process of how nominations, we call them nominations for inscription, are evaluated. We have what we call our advisory bodies, which is ICOMOS for culture sites and IUCN for natural sites. And they are a group of experts that go out and evaluate the nominations. And then what what UNESCO does, we serve as the secretariat to the convention, and then we put forward the recommendations of UNESCO and the advisory bodies to the World Heritage Committee. The World Heritage Committee is the deciding body on World Heritage inscription, and it's a subset of all of the state parties to the convention. So all of the countries that have signed the World Heritage Convention come together every 2 years and elect between I think 10 and 12 members to the World Heritage Committee. There's a little over, I think there's 23 members total.
Okay. And once a site receives this designation, what benefits does it receive, or what sort of protection does it get?
Well, in order to be inscribed, it has to have the highest protection in that country. So UNESCO doesn't there isn't any and the conservation of the sites, because I want to underscore that the World Heritage Convention, it's a conservation legal instrument. So it's really trying to protect these sites, and that's what it's all about. And so we help them do that. UNESCO helps them through various means to help them to protect the sites, but ultimately it's the responsibility of that country to protect the sites.
And I imagine then having the designation makes it easier for them to protect the site because they can say we're a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and therefore we can have these guidelines, this framework, these protections.
Absolutely. I think it does help them in that sense, and I think it doesn't give any extra protection in the legal sense, because again, as I said, that's kind of a sovereign issue depending on the country, but it does
Mm-hmm.
give them that. And there's also a process of it's one of the few conservation instruments globally that has a monitoring and reporting mechanism. So they have to provide a state of conservation report, for instance, to UNESCO, and that again gets evaluated. We also have a process for sites that are having trouble perhaps with their conservation, and a lot of sites, for instance, in conflict zones, etc. And we have what we call the World Heritage Endangered List. And so those sites that are again experiencing those kinds of challenges could be put on the World Heritage Endangered List, and then that sort of triggers a whole international process to help them solve those problems. So it really is a mechanism. It's sort of evolved into more of a, people see it as punitive, but it really is a way to really focus on some of the problems that they're having, and then activate the international community to help solve them.
Makes sense. That totally makes sense. If a site winds up on the endangered list, um, to bring the topic back around to what we're talking about today, is oftentimes that have to do with climate change, or is climate change becoming more of a factor at putting some of these places at risk?
Well, it's increasingly so. Yes, absolutely. I think especially when we're looking at some of the natural sites that are very vulnerable to climate change, it's an issue. And I think what we're seeing, that even cultural sites now are at risk from sea level rise, etc. So I think in the future it's really going to be probably one of the driving factors for some sites going on the endangered list is or related to climate impacts.
Yeah, are you seeing, for instance, I think there's a site in the Maldives that's at risk because of rising sea levels. I imagine there's probably an increasing number of places in Europe that are at risk of fires. In your monitoring, where are you seeing some of the biggest issues?
Yeah, it's usually, I mean, I think some of the where we're seeing some some of the bigger issues are in coral reef systems of the world. So, those are really vulnerable to coral bleaching with the rising ocean temperature. So I think that's something that's very significant. Um, we're also seeing in some sites, some cultural sites in the UK, Skara Brae, for instance, it's vulnerable to coastal erosion from sea level rise. So we're definitely seeing this happening now. I think also there's the thing especially in Mediterranean countries with wildfires having they haven't had a direct impact on the World Heritage sites, but they've come close. So again, these are kind of the things that we're seeing in real time that are having the impact.
Yeah, I imagine it seems as if European heat waves are now sort of an annual event, as are
Mm.
some of the fires that have been occurring. But sea level rise has definitely been uniform, as has coral bleaching, which is devastating to see. So it sounds like that a coral bed can be a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which I was not aware of.
Yeah, I think probably the most famous one is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. I mean, it's a huge tourism destination. I mean, it's one of the crown jewels really of certainly in Australia, but actually in the World Heritage Site and World Heritage System itself. And there are other coral reef system in Belize, for example, is another one that's a World Heritage Sites, and those are really vulnerable to climate change. And it's really difficult because, in terms of these mega environmental impacts that are happening because of climate change, in terms of, trying to turn things around, it's, because again, as I mentioned, it's the responsibility of the state party to manage these sites. But it becomes more and more difficult when it's these things that in some ways you don't have control over, the weather systems of the world. So but I think what UNESCO says, and what I think the community is responding to, that even that, so we really have to make them more resilient and less vulnerable, so and that's includes, decreasing pollution and some of the other stressors that could be affecting these sites. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of progress and insights, really trying to prepare for that warmer world and trying to decrease some of these other stressors that are having an impact.
Yeah, it's that's an interesting thought, because the idea of coral reefs being affected by rising ocean temperatures. It's, again, as you were saying, something that the site itself can't protect itself. You know, the Australian government can't do anything about an immediate rise in ocean temperature. So it sounds like what you and UNESCO is hoping for is that some of these red flags cause will help create change within a country, within sort of the broader dialogue that people are having about climate change.
Absolutely. I mean, it's climate change is one of the, you know, the issues where it's going to take all of us working together to solve. And so it's not just one country that's going to do it, but again, and that's a whole nother UN process that's looking at you know, climate emissions. The IPCC is the UN body that's looking at that. But again, I think what we're seeing again within the World Heritage System is it's becoming more and more acute. Some of these impacts.
Um, just to sort of sidestep climate change for a moment, I'm wondering if over tourism becomes a part of this conversation as well. It's not necessarily climate change, but it is something that is leading to climate change and also perhaps endangering some of these areas.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, if you look at sort of travel in general and its contribution to global emissions, it's significant. And that's sort of the irony or the problem that we're seeing with travel and tourism and climate change and World Heritage is that many of these places rely on tourism because tourism is vital for many of these economies. And I mean, let's face it, we all love to travel. We're all travelers. I mean, we want to see different places. And the core of the World Heritage Convention is that these sites are so extraordinary that they have what we call outstanding universal value. And it's a heritage for everybody. So it's not just that one country or that one region, but for, you know, for it's a global kind of a system. And I think because of that, you know, this idea of you know, how we travel and how we take care of them, it's not just up to the country, but it's how we travel as tourists, how we visit the sites. And that's sort of how, you know, in terms of when we make our travel decisions to go, you know, either farther afield or closer to home is going to have an impact. But you know, some of these sites, like in the Pacific, there's only one way to get there usually, and that's by airplane. So it really is. And you mentioned the Maldives, although I don't think there's a World Heritage site in the Maldives, but it is very vulnerable to rising seas. So again, these are some of the issues that we're grappling with in terms of tourism and climate change and World Heritage. Is that how do you continue to make these places, you know, available for people to experience? There's in the World Heritage Convention text, there's actually no mention. I think there's only one mention of tourism, and it's actually in it is mentioned as a potential threat. But in terms of the convention itself, is you have to the by a country signing up to it, they're obligated to transmit and present that heritage, and that's what connects it to tourism. So that transmission and presentation is what tourism, I think, is all about. And we obviously want to encourage the sites, you know, World Heritage sites, the tourism industry to really focus on that, focus on those cultural and natural values, and usually in really put that at the center of how they develop tourism, because it doesn't always happen that way.
That really is a conundrum. The idea that you are promoting these sites, or the sites should be promoted as cultural destinations, but on the other hand, or historically significant, but on the other hand, the risk that that poses to them. One of the things that a lot of tourism leaders in the industry have been talking about is ways to shift focus. You know, for instance, instead of having people go to Rome, they might go to a region in Spain that isn't as well visited. Spain might not be the best example because they're dealing with their own issues of over tourism, but that sort of idea of shifting. And I'm guessing there probably are enough World Heritage sites where that same thing could happen, where it might be, you know, instead of going to site A, go to site B in a place that isn't quite as well visited, as a way to, one, spread the wealth, and two, to kind of alleviate some of the pressure on the other sites.
Well, I think no, absolutely. I think there are, there's the iconic sites that the must-sees for people, but there are a lot of different sites and they're very equally as interesting. In fact, in terms of there's a term we say mirror destination. So if you take the case of Barcelona, for instance, which is in the news right now because of over tourism and how they've sort of breached a threshold with those with the residents in Barcelona. Because even in Barcelona, if you look at the surveys, people support tourism. They want tourism. They want to welcome tourists. I mean, the Spanish are incredibly hospitable. They have a long history of welcoming tourists. So I think all of these stressors are kind of coming together, and we're breaching that kind of a threshold where the balance is off. But just a few, probably a 30-minute train ride away is another town called Tarragona, which has amazing cultural heritage and beautiful beach, and so very similar attributes. And they probably could use more tourism in Tarragona, because everybody goes to Barcelona, they don't go to Tarragona. So absolutely, it's in fact one of the UNESCO was involved with National Geographic in a project a few years back in Europe where we were trying to highlight some of the other sort of off the beaten path kind of World Heritage sites that you perhaps weren't on your bucket list, and really trying to bring them alive with really rich content and trying to inspire them to go there. So I think we can do it, and I think that's kind of the sort of the way forward is looking more at that. And I think one thing though we have to be a bit careful, because another thing is about seasonality and how people travel, and in Europe it's people have holidays in August, so I don't it's going to take some systemic changes to change that, but in the meantime it's again it's where you go, and coming back to the climate change discussion, it's like the Mediterranean's getting hotter, so people probably will be shifting their so okay, we're going to go on holiday, but maybe they'll go to the Scandinavian countries because it's cooler or something along those lines. So I think climate is really going to be affecting the seasonality of tourism, and and how long and how much you can tolerate to be in which is basically a much hotter climate.
Yeah, yeah, it's like Italy, Spain, Greece. It's been brutal in August, traditionally months that, were, as you
Hmm.
were saying, just the European holidays. And I feel like in last year, a big discussion had been about those cool weather sites. You're mentioning people going Scandinavia or in North America, Canada, places that are
Mm.
cooler. And it feels as if that will perhaps alleviate some of that over tourism that's happening
Right.
in those traditionally popular places. I wanted to ask you a bit about cruise tourism. And for me, as someone who's been on cruises, who's gone into a port, it often feels like people will only go so far off the ship, or they'll only go to specific sites that are kind of designated excursions that the cruise company is offering. I'm wondering, because I know that there's a lot of CO2 emissions from cruise ships, if there are things that people on cruises could or should be doing to kind of help the places that they're going to.
No, exactly. I think the cruise industry is obviously taking this very seriously, and they are getting better in terms of reducing their emissions. For a long time, they used, the boats used like the dirtiest fuel, and I think that's really where they've made a lot of progress, which is great. I think
Mm-hmm.
and some of these new ships that are coming online are infinitely better than the other ones, because the reality is that people do like to go on cruises, and it's one of the fastest growing segments of the tourism industry. So and we can't deny that. But I think in terms of, again, there's a lot more that can be done in terms of the excursions and how people, when they go to destinations, because it is kind of like a flood coming into a destination, and that again puts a tremendous a lot of stress and pressure on the systems. And they then and in some of these iconic destinations, that's also been a tipping point for residents. It's just there's just too many people, and typically don't the destination itself doesn't get a benefit from that kind of tourism because it's the all-inclusive model, right? So they don't eat lunch in the destination, they eat lunch on the ship. So again, they're just not spending very much money, which would make it a lot better if they could. So that model needs to change. And I think there are some smaller ship companies that are able to do that where they're making headway. I think Lindblad is probably the industry leader in terms of having a different kind of model for cruise tourism. But again, this is something that's really we really need to grapple with because even the tourism in general, it's like the whole leakage of tourism that, money does not stay in the destination where it's needed the most, not only for, for the local economies, but to improve the infrastructure and services. So, because if you manage a destination for the residents, first and foremost, it's going to be good for the tourists too. So, but I think a lot of times it's reverse, they really have infrastructure and things more for the tourists that have a negative effect on the residents. So I think cruise tourism really, I think it really needs to change in terms of that and how they come into destinations and how they spend money basically, because that's the issue. I think if there was a better model there probably won't be as much opposition to cruises in these, and then they're huge. You don't want to see a big cruise ship if you're like in the canal in Venice, and that's again what we're seeing in many of these destinations like Barcelona. With these protests is that's how historically brings about change, right? And that happened in Venice. There was a huge outcry about the big ships in Venice, and they stopped it. There's no longer big cruise ships going to Venice. I mean, cruises are still going to, to Venice, and they get off at a different place, but at least you're not that visual integrity is maintained, which is I think a real issue for a lot of these destinations.
Yeah, that really was that iconic photo of the giant cruise ship looming over Venice that still sticks
Mm-hmm.
in my mind. And you raise a good point about the numbers on cruise ships. I mean, if there are 2 or 3 ships in dock in each ship, and this is these days sort of a mid-sized cruise ship is 2, 3,000, maybe 4,000 people. They're all docked one time, and then you've got 15,000 people in a relatively small destination. They're there for the day. As you say, they have lunch on board, breakfast on board, go into town, go to the one place, leave, maybe get the selfie they need to get at whatever vista.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't seem like it would be sustainable for these locations to have these ships coming in. So the idea of smaller ships or different destinations seems like it would be a huge improvement for them.
Right, I think so too, and I just think again limiting the numbers. That's Dubrovnik did that. There's only so many numbers of ships that can be there at one time, and I think even with visitor management and some of these, where there is cruise tourism, because again they do bring a lot of money to ports and things like that. So you can't deny that. So there is a benefit there, but I think in that sense, so how it just needs to be controlled. We just have to control it better, and there are, I think, some breakthroughs that we've had in terms of that. It can't just be an unfettered, okay, everything goes kind of approach.
Right, exactly. The idea, though, of climate change and some of these significant places, is there something that we as travelers can do to help mitigate? Because you mentioned the conundrum of travel. We want to see these places. The idea is that these UNESCO World Heritage Sites should be seen. But on the other hand, we need to get on an airplane or in a ship to see them, therefore, creating more CO2. I realize it's a very roundabout way of asking the question, but is there anything that we as travelers can do to kind of support and also help when it comes to UNESCO sites and climate change?
I mean, certainly. I mean, we could, when you can take different kinds of transport, stay closer to home, so you're not having to jump on a plane. and experience, your own cultural heritage. I mean, you're in Boston. I actually, my home base. I'm based in Paris now at UNESCO, but my home base is in Maine, and Maine is called vacation land, and people go there, and because of that, because it's cooler, and it's not very far, for a lot of people. So I think that's certainly one way to do it. And there's other schemes out there to like carbon offsetting, in terms of your flight, and then when you're in the destination, to ensure that you're traveling, sort of eco-friendly in terms of the choices that you make. So if you're taking public transportation, not renting a car, for instance, and even little small things like not buying bottled water, bringing a bottle with you, and refilling it. I think it's Visit Copenhagen that just started an eco-friendly campaign where they're giving people credit or free stuff if they do that, if they take a bike rather than public transport, if they take public transport rather than take a car. And I think those are the kinds of things that are really interesting, because yes, we as travelers need to make those better choices, but we also need to be given the choices in the first place, sort of, well, what can I do? And that's where I think places like, I mean, organizations like tourism boards and things like that really have a role to play. And because they market destinations, and that's another conundrum for like the head of the Italian tourism board. They shouldn't be putting Venice on their posters, but I'm not sure if they do or not, but they probably do, because they know that there's a person born every second that hasn't been to Venice, and everybody should go to Venice. It's an amazing place. But it's just, again, it's how and when you do it. But I just want to, it sort of triggered a thought in my head, though, in terms of, one of the things we do also say in terms of sustainable tourism within a destination is to to spread people out within that destination. So there's always the selfie sites where you want to snap that photo, but we have to be careful that you're just not moving the problems around. And that's, I think, where Venice has been very successful, in getting visitors to not just come in the summer, but guess what? They still come in the summer, and they're coming in November, and so it's packed the whole time. So, and that's also the caveat as things shift with climate changes. New destinations pop up to make sure that those destinations that are emerging and getting more visitors are prepared for that. And that's, it really comes down to how we manage those visitors, because you can manage visitors in a way where you can actually increase numbers, because again, there's a lot of talk about carrying capacities and limiting numbers, and again, it's all going to come down to how those visitors are managed and how we move within a destination.
Right. Venice is an interesting example, given that I think they now charge people a tax
Yes.
or a fee to go into the city or a particular area of the city. And it feels as if we'll be seeing more of that in the future, I imagine. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there were somewhere in Barcelona that started something similar, or Paris, as a way to kind of control. And it's also interesting because there are those bucket list places that people feel like they need to see, like Venice.
Yeah.
And that feels like it puts a little more pressure on the site, of course, and we as travelers who might want to take that photo of the bridge in Venice, or that particular spot that we need to have. Is there a way, we talk about going to different spots, that bucket list place we can get on the list, obviously off season, or should we stop thinking about bucket list as a way of travel?
Absolutely. I think we really have to really rethink how we approach it. I mean, it's the same with, the bucket list and the selfie travel of getting that one site. I think there's a famous site of Mount Fuji in Japan, where this small village, it was just like the perfect shot of Mount Fuji. And there was some influencers that popped up on their social media feed, and all of a sudden they're inundated. And what they did is they built a big thing to block the view. So now, but I mean, that's not, but I think people are resorting to those kind of more extreme measures. But again, I think this gets back to visitor behavior and how we visit sites and making sure that, it's not about that photo, but it's actually really taking the time, slowing down, really experiencing the destination. And if you do that, you're going to have a better experience, and the locals are going to be happier because you're spending money, you're staying longer, and you're not overburdening those systems. So I think that really is going to be key if we're going to be successful in all this.
Yeah, I feel like in many ways social media and influencers have kind of ruined some of the basic tenets of travel. But that's just me as a travel writer who gets annoyed with people stopping and they have to have the one photo and it just clogs everything for the rest of us. Um, I won't blame climate change entirely on influencers, even though I'd like to. But when it comes to rising sea levels, fires, warming seas, all of those things, you've mentioned some of the things that we can do. You've mentioned a lot of the things that we can do. Are there particular sites that are in sort of immediate danger right now?
Mhm. Well, I think we're seeing in the US some of the big national parks, and many of them are actually World Heritage sites where, people are literally dying because of the heat. They get trapped somehow, they don't have water. It's really, I think we're seeing it obviously here in Europe as well. I mentioned before with Athens is closing the Parthenon during certain times of the day because it's just too hot. And trying to get those messages, those campaigns to tell people that that they need to take care. But there's also a duty of care of the destinations to take care of the people as well, and ensuring that happens is really going to put a big burden on them, I think. So again, these things are happening now. They're real, and we need to really realize that. It's becoming, I think, very dangerous in some of these sites.
Yeah, it sounds like it's something that not only the local governments need to worry about, but also travelers. And it seems like, I mean, I'm guessing for the most part, travelers have been smart about making these changes. Obviously, we realize
Yeah,
it's hotter.
right. I think so.
Um,
I think so. I think it's probably more scary, if you would, if there's like some freak weather event, like a big downpour. These things again are happening. There's flooding that happens. You have to evacuate people. Again, this is something that you sometimes can't prepare for. The forecast may be fine when you leave, but it may change very quickly. A wildfire comes through, for instance, that's also happened where they've had to evacuate tourists, and you have to do it very quickly. So again, having those, you're in an area that's prone to that. So you really have to put in place those measures to help you do that. The whole health and safety issues of climate change, for tourism is, I think, going to be really probably one of the more existential things we need to deal with.
yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking about the hurricane season in the Caribbean and how, for instance, this
Exactly.
year, earlier, I think we had a Category 5 hurricane earlier than any other year. And that seems like that's another potential problem for people
Mm,
evacuating a
mm,
place and really just needing to be prepared or perhaps adjusting the time that they're traveling to that part of the world.
absolutely. And again, that has a big impact on the local economies because, as I mentioned, some of these places rely on tourism so much. So when, people start changing their, they don't go to the Caribbean because of hurricanes, it's going to have a really big impact on those communities, which is terrible.
Exactly. Exactly. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about these things. And I know that our readers and listeners and watchers are equally equally in touch with these things because we all love to travel. We all want to see these places, and you've given us some really fantastic advice on going forward or how our approach should be. So thank you so much.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Chris,
Thanks.
and happy travels.
Thank you so much. You as well.
Take care.